So we might begin. Good evening. This is the fifth Monday of the month, so that's the reason I'm here tonight, to enjoy an extra opportunity to present some basic ideas about Buddhist approaches to life, and in particular approaches to meditation. Meditations that are going to be very useful, very, very valuable in terms of dealing with things as they arise. So the topic's not in any way academic, it's really to do with practical solutions and novel approaches to working with problems, and also relishing the opportunity of enjoying certain opportunities in our lives in a very, very productive and sort of wholesome manner. So for many of us, we find we ricochet and bounce off all of these things in a quite chaotic fashion, trying to squeeze the essence from things, at the same time push things away that are causing a lot of problem, and other things just make us numb or even stupefied. So we try to juggle these sorts of mixed emotions, often not very successfully. So the purpose of beginning a meditation practice is to come home to ourselves on the spot where we're sitting. So many of us know the tendency when we're very, very anxious or restless or even disturbed, that we tend to jump almost out of our bodies. We kind of are so anxious mentally, that mental process dominates our awareness. And so much so that we forget the state of the body. And of course this is one of the profound reasons why so many of us end up having stress-related illnesses, because we have simply not paid sufficient attention to the poor body that we're dragging along behind the turmoil of our mental state. So the body can only stand so much. And they're extraordinarily resilient, wondrously resilient things when we think about it. It's a lot of soft tissue and conduits with liquids flowing through it, and phlegm and sinews and bones that can splinter, and soft mushy marrow and molecules, organic ones coming and going, trying to exchange some molecular sort of nutriments from the food we're imbibing and then excreting. The whole process is extraordinary. We replace our entire body over a number of years, as we know, just sort of shedding it and taking it on. So it's a very, very fragile but marvellous ship to sail. And so the Buddhist sort of approach to this body is not to be attached to it in a kind of desperate clinging, because that's a form of folly. It's bound to fail because we can't keep this body stationary. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that most of us can't remember being held in one hand almost by our mother. Well, that small, we could be lifted like that. We're a little crying infant. It's hard to relate. This is just simply the continuation of that little crying infant of this lifetime. And then at some point, I had my own version of this a few years ago when I had my first student stand up for me in a tram to offer me a seat. And I realised I'd passed over a certain invisible line, never to return. I realised then my radiant attractiveness was perhaps faded, and that my allure was also not quite as magnificent as I had pretended. And so there's quite a lot of shocks and realisations as we go on the journey with our body. And many of us, of course, also deal with illnesses and injuries. So this is not to become morbid or kind of overly vigilant or sensitive, but it's to be realistic. So the Buddhist approach is to treasure this body as a vehicle for living well, and that living well involves being able to work creatively and flexibly, adaptively with our minds. And so meditation can do both those things at once. It can help us relax and tend the body, and it can also help us begin to understand the way in which our minds work, together with their incredible scope for transformation. So this body, this one, has a limit to how much it can transform. And we know this if any of us exercise or go to the gym, or athletes or sports people. We reach a certain threshold of excellence, and then we can't maintain that state indefinitely, and invariably we fall. We call it retirement. Most sports people retire at a certain juncture, hopefully gracefully. So it's just simply a recognition that the body reaches a limit. The human can only jump so high. We keep slightly improving that, centimetre by centimetre, but there's definitely a limit there. But the Buddhist approach to the mind is that its positive potential is limitless, completely unlike the body. And that if we begin to remove the layers of restriction, or the clouds that are obscuring our potential mentally, the natural capabilities of the mind will shine spontaneously. We don't have to find those qualities. And this is why we talk in Buddhism of Buddha nature. We all have this seed of enlightenment. It's not a little sort of seed locked away somewhere like a plant seed. It's talking about this innate capacity for absolutely radical transformation towards positive goals. And so positive goals are those that are based in reality, and or impossible goals, if you like, are those that are based on confusion and delusion. And they're limited, fortunately, but incredibly potent and incredibly powerful. So a delusion, such as anger, blocks us from performing positive actions. It's a truism, obviously. But the more we generate that mind, the less capable we're going to be of exploring our potential in positive ways and beginning to grow and transform. So we become chronically we keep dismantling our potential by reenacting those scenes of lacking in skill and clarity. So meditation is also a tool for beginning to sift and identify particular mental states and to creatively work with them. And so this is actually the most extraordinary tool that could be possibly given. It's more precious than anything in the external world. We can rely on certain things to support us in the external world, but none of them can do what we can do by looking after our own minds. So this is said to be our prime responsibility. Not because we want to be selfish and perfect ourselves, but because our responsibility as a social being, interdependently related to all others, is that we try to produce states where others can thrive in harmonious and ways that aren't frightening or scary or dangerous. So the delusions, Buddhism talks about delusions. We're not talking about those as kind of sins because we've fallen from some innate primordial state of grace. Very different structure here. A delusion in Buddhism is referring to any mind that when it arises in our continuum of being causes agitation. Fascinating definition. Agitation. So desirous attachment is agitated. We know this, don't we? We go shopping. You see agitated people shopping all the time. In fact, they lose their way, agitated people shopping. They don't even see where they are or where they're walking. Have you noticed this? They'll often stand in front of you trying to make a decision about what they just saw, and they've forgotten that they're standing on a footpath blocking 8 people. There's no awareness there. So these are just sort of colourful examples, but we write these very large on our minds, and so we can spend weeks apparently immersed in a state of great upheaval because of some anxiety about our loss of job or a loss of a relationship or a sudden diagnosis of a serious illness and so forth. And so how do we work with that? So Buddhism says, come in, sit, and just see what's there. Just let go of all the other stuff that's there. Not to say it doesn't matter, but for the moment it doesn't matter. And afford yourself this extraordinary opportunity. So when I said before there's no sort of judgment coming from outside that's measuring our states of mind, that's not to say that we don't or can't. And so one of the techniques in Buddhist meditation is to develop the skill to identify particular mental states and to begin to creatively work and rework them. So this is a very, very precious tool to begin to explore. So as we have done on previous Mondays, we're going to start with a meditation, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the breath, and we're going to sail seamlessly from the breath to awareness of the body. And this is our way of grounding ourselves. And it's a very, very subtle and powerful technique. So some people think the breath is a boring subject, and when they begin to meditate on it, they get frustrated that it seems a bit colourless or kind of lacking in excitement. But this is actually a very, very interesting moment for us, because we have to allow all of those expecting minds, all of those grasping minds, all of those pushing away minds, and all of those bored in sort of wipe-out minds that try to just rub things out when we don't like them. You have to let all of that go and simply allow sheer awareness of our object to be our primary focus. So there's something very exciting here in this idea of sheer awareness, because when we find that we can stabilise it, not stabilise it by keeping it without moving, but we don't lose it. That's what stability means here. We can stay with the object as it moves, i.e. the breath. We'll find that it becomes more powerful and more interesting by its own nature, because the mind begins to merge with its object spontaneously. So the hard distinction we have, I, Ross, am meditating on this, my breath, that sort of dualistic structuring of our situation just begins to melt away. The hardness of it melts, and the breath becomes us and we become the breath, and together we continue the focus. And sort of becomes, we can't talk about becoming one because there's still two distinct things in reality, but the experience is of merging, and that subtlety is something very, very precious. And if we can ride that subtlety as it becomes more and more subtle, we'll find that the metabolism, physical metabolism, naturally and very profoundly subsides. And this enables an enormous opportunity to rest. Nice word to hear. And it's a different form of rest from the kind of exhausted conking out on the sofa and dropping into a state of torpor or unconsciousness that we might have. This is a state of aware restfulness. We're absolutely awake and absolutely relaxed. This is quite a special state to be in. So that when we get up and start to do stuff, it doesn't seem quite as difficult to remain more relaxed and to travel through things in a more coherent and gentle fashion, we can begin to take care of our bodies a little bit more as well, because we become more sensitized to their needs. So let's draw our minds inwards. I used on the first night the analogy of a kite. It's a very good one, because our mind has been skitting around from here and there, up and down, this way, that way. Sometimes far away, sometimes close, sometimes dropping, sometimes soaring. So draw the mind into the body as we might draw a kite from the sky. Withdraw, in other words, from all of our daily engagements, activities. Bring the mind into this meditation room. In the present moment, so letting go of thoughts of the past, projections of the future, what we might be doing tomorrow or even later tonight. Just be here now with the body on the spot where we're sitting. Now become conscious of how the body is being experienced. In other words, just sort of move through the body and just get a sense of how the body is feeling. For an example, we might find areas of tension or tiredness or soft, subtle pain in a joint or whatever. Whatever it might be, just note it to ourselves. And now, with the out-breath, let these tirednesses or problems leave the body in the form of smoke, which tumbles away into the distance and dissolving, not leaving even an atom behind. And with the immediate in-breath, radiant light comes into the body, relaxing, opening the body. This in turn releases more subtle levels of tension or tiredness, etc., which then dissolve with the next out-breath. So we can quietly work from the crown to the feet, or we can take the whole body as an entity, thinking of it as a vessel. In which case we can visualize the body slowly filling with radiant light, and this is what displaces any problems of the body with the out-breath. Just as we might fill up a vessel to the brim. We can also concentrate on a particular part of the body if it's problematic. If we do have a particular illness in a particular part of the body, then of course we can spend some extra time here. So it effectively becomes a healing meditation. And now we shift from the body as our focus to the mind. Just becoming aware of our mind. And if we find the mind agitated or downcast or tired, just let these feelings or mental states leave with the out-breath in the form of smoke, and inhale radiant light which pervades the mind, just as light might pervade space. And if we have lots and lots of thoughts tumbling over each other, let these go with the out-breath and inhale calm, spacious mind with the in-breath. So again we work with our actual situation. Radiant light in, problems out. This can be a very, very powerful technique to use when we are very upset or angry. Just to sit and do this meditation is very effective. We don't need to intellectualize a remedy. We simply do the visualization with the experience of the emotion, letting it go. Now we establish the motivation for the meditation, trying to transform our usual preoccupations with our immediate self into something more expansive. We do this in conjunction, well, in many ways, but as we have been this month, we'll do this in conjunction with the 4 immeasurable thoughts. And the idea is that we feel these wishes that are embedded in the thoughts from the very depths of our heart. So they're not ideas so much as very, very strong aspirations rising up from the very core of our being. Thinking how wonderful it would be if all beings without exception had happiness and its causes. May they have happiness and its causes. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. And here we can substitute any other object that is suitable. If we're looking at it from a sort of agnostic or atheistic perspective, we can be thinking to ourselves that may my own best potential inspire me to overcome my limited potential, so that we can carry out these thoughts. We can still work with the mind. The second immeasurable thought: how wonderful it would be if all beings, without exception, were free of suffering and its causes. So here we can actually think of those beings who are suffering, and we don't have to look very far. We have to think of war-torn Syria or Yemen, or even children on islands off the shore of Australia and their families. People in physical and mental distress, even in our own families or neighbourhoods. How wonderful if they were free of suffering and its causes. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. How wonderful it would be if all beings without exception achieved only higher rebirth and the supreme bliss of liberation, or temporary and ultimate happiness, unimaginable happiness. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. Again, and we absorb the energy to actually do this. And the fourth immeasurable thought: how wonderful it would be if all beings without exception were free from attachment and hatred, free from holding some close and others distant. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. So this very expansive, altruistic motivation in place, we now simply alight upon the breath. So mindfulness is that state of, or that ability to remember our object that was just present in the moment before. Of course, things are flowing from one moment to the next. The breath is unfolding from one moment to the next. So in order to remain with it, we have to unfold with the breath. So we have to travel with the breath as it goes out and comes in. So we're not controlling the breathing process in this meditation. We're merely simply observing. Being aware of the middle, end, beginning, continuous flow. If the mind is chattering, having some conversation, perhaps with recollections or fantasies or preoccupations, these are distractions. So we have to let them go and return to the breath. So from time to time we need to check with a corner of the mind, and if it's in place we continue, and if the mind has scattered, we replace. Where is the mind? Is it on the breath? One minute of second of distraction leads to a second. This means that in the second moment of distraction, our mindfulness has lapsed because we haven't remembered the object from the moment before. We've lost it, displaced it with the new distracted object, in which case we need to swing back to our chosen object, the breath. If we're sluggish or tired, becoming sleepy, or feel like we're sinking, we need to tighten the force of our mindfulness. Just make a little more effort, determination to hold the breath more firmly. Not hold it literally by not breathing, but hold it as an object more firmly. Just as you might hold an object in our hand so we don't drop it. We don't squeeze it, but neither are we careless or slip away otherwise. which is maybe what's been happening. So just hold it more firmly. Or if we're having the opposite problem, we're really agitated mentally and we can't seem to hold the breath at all, then we need to alight upon the breath with delicacy and gentleness, not pushing or striving. Gently. Now we substitute the breath with awareness of the body, as I mentioned earlier. Just as we did with the breath, we're not attempting to control or manipulate our awareness of the body in any way. Simply be aware. In an interesting way, awareness permeates the body. Wherever our awareness is, there's also a sense of embodiment. It can be in our fingers, our hands, our limbs, our torso, on the surface of the body, internally with the organs, their movements and so forth. It's actually a vast cosmology of things going on. Simply be aware, whatever is happening. In particular, be aware that we're sitting. Chogyam Trungpa, one of the Tibetan Lamas, very influential in the transmission of the Tibetan tradition to America, made a joke here that our thoughts have a flat bottom. Our awareness is sitting on our bottom. We're sitting in our body. So just allow ourselves to be aware of our body sitting just as it is right now. Now let go of the body awareness and return to awareness of the breath. Doesn't mean that the body awareness ceases to appear, of course, but the main focus is the breath. Just for the last few moments of the meditation, enhance the clarity of our focus. Make our awareness of the breath more vivid, more acute, more precise. And in the last moment of the meditation, we let go of the breath and we give away any advantages or positive things that have arisen in the time of the meditation towards fulfilling those four immeasurable thoughts that we established. We can think how remarkable that even for these few moments of meditating together, we haven't harmed ourselves, nor have we harmed another person. We've been able to sit here together safely and securely, without fear. This is not the case for many people in the world at the moment. So give away our peaceful energy with a thought that may all beings be without trouble and live in harmony and peace. And with that we conclude the meditation. It's hard not to be following American politics at the moment. Not that American politics are more important than any other politics, but it's the incredible dishevelment, isn't it, of the political symbolic machine in America that's so distressing, because it's, they said in the paper the other day that 40% of Americans believe there's going to be a civil war in the next 10 years. So that's how these sort of polarisation's occurring. But I'm looking at it from a Buddhist perspective, that we've got all these incredibly harsh minds being produced that are causing incredible social upheaval and distress, and it's threatening world peace and world harmony in very serious ways. So I'm not saying America's the sole protagonist, but it's a very, very interesting situation to observe. So Buddhism says that if we're going to be a sort of a viable ethical agent, which of course we want to be, we have to start with this one. Because if this one's not harming and is benefiting others, then we've got some opportunity of beginning to develop a civil society. Otherwise not. So, are there any questions or thoughts that have come up that you'd like to discuss or broach? It is the last of my Monday, so you might have had something sort of hanging over from one of the other presentations as well. Yep.
It's just a question about benefiting others and a comment that I've heard over the years in the past. My observation has been that sometimes in trying to do the right thing by other people,
Mm-hmm.
we as humans might be inclined to do is to project out assumptions or beliefs about what that might be onto another person. And maybe that's appropriate, maybe it's accurate, maybe it's not. I just want to hear any thoughts around that.
Did everyone hear that? It's, I might try to paraphrase it. It's we wish to help others and to benefit them, but in the process of doing that or aiming to do that, we end up projecting stuff that may or may not be beneficial. It might be coming from us, it might actually be suitable or useful or applicable, or it might not be relevant at all. So it's a very important point, isn't it? Buddhist sort of approaches to this are to try to look more and more deeply into the structure of what it is that we might be doing and also what we might be offering. And so one of the very simple levels, which it sort of, when I first heard this, it sort of struck me as remarkable because it was so blatantly obvious, but I'd never really thought about it, which is that we have three doors of activity in the world. One is physical, one is verbal, and one is mental. And of course they're all interrelated. That's what we've been exploring in our meditation. But we have to be responsible for those three. I.e., we have to be responsible for our behaviour through those three doors. So an example of the middle door, speech. When we use speech as a harsh, abusive weapon, we're causing injury to the other. And of course it's often our partner or our child or our parent, ageing parent, whoever. We don't have to go very far, do we? To begin to see what happens when that voice becomes enraged. I'm just using the example of rage here because it's a very vivid example. And so Buddhism says that we have to recognise that and take that raised voice back. Don't yield to it, in other words, and see if we can produce, if we can't produce another voice at that moment that's going to be less harsh and less damaging, then don't produce any voice for a while. Stop yelling. Just simply stop. On the spot, stop. And so that's very, very profound and very, very simple. And it's the same with our body. If we're using our body to kind of create problems for ourselves and others, then to step back. And the mind is the most subtle of all because it's charging those other two doors. And so if our mind's out of control, it's likely that our speech is out of control and our body's out of control. And so caring for the mind, the door of the mind, is the most powerful and the most necessary. So if we keep coming back to that, we then have an opportunity with a more candid and positive mind to then put something out through those three doors. I'm getting to your answer. That's going to be beneficial. And it could often be as simple as not harming someone. And at least not harming someone today, or this morning, or before we go to bed. You know, to try to work with our actual situation. And so it's not saying we're out of control and we're going to explode and we're a dangerous force and we have to be kind of quarantined, but that when the deluded minds are active, they can empower those three doors to lose control, and then it becomes very, very difficult to work with the situation. So the other thing that we do in meditation is try to develop very, very powerful positive states of mind which are universalistic, if you like. And so I would like to think that immeasurable love, which is embodied in that wishing that all beings have happiness and not to suffer, is a quite remarkable mind to begin to try to put out. Because even if we're practicing it in meditation, it means that when we do see people, we respond to them differently. We're more sensitive. We're more aware of their need, whatever that might be. And so our ability to read and work with actual situations becomes skillfully enhanced. So we know how to respond. It's not that we've learnt how to respond by being told. We actually know how to respond. So I'll tell a very sort of moving, sad story for me, because it was to do with my mother's death in the Wangaratta hospital. And she'd had organ failure and she'd been put on life support, but no one had said, oh, we're putting your mum on life support. I don't, other people may have had this experience. They just kept doing one medical procedure after another without stopping, and we didn't really get to be part of that conversation. The doctors in Wangaratta seemed to be old-fashioned doctors who didn't talk to people about their treatments, they simply did them. They didn't really show any willingness to have a dialogue with the family, for example. Anyway, so before we knew it, my mother was on life support. And then the doctor, rather remarkably, came up to me. I was with my sister and also my father, who was in a state of kind of numbed shock, and said, "What do you want us to do with the machine?" Can you believe this? What do you, i.e. me, want me, i.e. the doctor, to do with the machine? Because it's actually now looking after keeping your mother alive. And so we were suddenly faced with what has to be a remarkably potent ethical decision at a time when we had had no preparation and no support and no communication that enabled any kind of preparation for that decision to be made. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we decided, my mother had indicated she could blink. She couldn't talk because she had a tracheotomy and a lot of problems there, and so she could talk with her eyes. Anyway, I just want to mention that the poignant part of the story, she indicated that she was happy for the machine to be turned off. So that relieved us of that responsibility, because when my sisters and I had decided that it has to be turned off because she had organ failure, it was just not going to... I mean, she would be kept maybe alive on that machine for some weeks, but she could never recover. And it was just a matter of time until she got pneumonia or septicemia and so forth. And plus having terrible suffering to do with the actual having tubes down your lungs and so forth. Anyway, when I went to see her knowing that it was going to be the last time, it was in the ICU, and there's a bank of stuff up here where all the nurses sit and sort of watch. They also come down and do things, machines buzzing, fluorescent lights. And I was sitting there looking at my mother, who couldn't talk, and I suddenly fell forward and sobbed. And it was as if I'd been struck by a giant bolt in the stomach. Because when I say I fell forward, I just went clunk and collapsed. It was just like, I can't explain what that feeling was and I just sobbed. And I thought to myself, I'm sobbing. And I thought, I'm sobbing in an ICU unit with my mother in front of me. And I realised that that's okay. So I just didn't, I just dwelt with that feeling. And then I, after, managed to sit up, and this is a bit of the story I'm telling. And of course I had tears pouring down, and my mother, who was too weak to move, went like this with one hand and one finger. You know what she was doing? To wipe the tear from my cheek. How extraordinary is that? And in that gesture, we said goodbye to each other. And just for me, that poignancy of that gesture is absolutely remarkable, because the whole universe of our relationship, which had been fraught, we sometimes have fraught relationships with the most precious people in our lives, but we were saying goodbye and we knew it, and she used the last of her energy to gesture to caring for me, which of course is such an extraordinary embodiment of motherhood. And I then had this experience, and I hazard to mention it because this is a real experience. I don't think it's a mystical experience, but it's one that I've never ever had before. I saw myself through my mother's eyes looking at me, and I felt that she was in me looking at her. The feeling was that we had crossed over. In the recognition of that gesture, I felt that we actually swapped places. And it just lasted for a second, this sudden switch. And I don't know what that experience was, but it's certainly the most profound moment of empathy that I can recollect in this lifetime. So there's an incredible power here to do with the body, isn't there? That's really the basis of the story, but how we can use the body to express positive things in the most remarkable way. So to use the body as something that's going to protect and be gentle with other bodies, rather than push them and injure them and fragment them and torture them and whatever, is extraordinarily important. The same with our speech, the same with our minds. Yeah. So this sort of idea of getting back to more universal, limitless states of positive mind, like immeasurable love. It's called immeasurable because it's including each and every being without limit. So there's no measure to the expanse of that mind. That then enables our little local love mind, in this case, which wants to give, to begin to see the act of giving differently. Because when my mother was doing that gesture to wipe a tear, you say, oh yeah, she's just wiping a tear. But no, she wasn't just wiping a tear. She was expressing everything she possibly could in that single gesture, which was available to her. And so all of that was possible because of the way it was being charged or informed by her mental wish, her conscious wish to speak at that moment in the only way that she knew. So I had a lot of experiences in that hospital time. I had someone say to me, what was the point of visiting, because my mother couldn't talk. And that response shocked me, I must say, and I said, I don't talk, I hold her hand. Because I had been holding my mother's hand, and I'm sure that my mother had held mine many a time when I was that little baby. And you see mothers holding hands an enormous amount, don't you? It's a remarkable thing to hold someone's hand. And it was an unjudgmental holding. It wasn't trying to achieve anything. And so just to be there with, I'm not talking about myself here, but when someone's, for example, dying, just to be there is incredibly special. And people do remarkable things. When I was in the bone marrow transplant unit, There was one mother who visited her daughter who had had multiple episodes of acute leukemic sort of collapse, and she was going through yet another transplant, and her daughter was a young woman, and the mother spent what appeared to me to be 24 hours of every day in that hospital room with her daughter, occasionally going with her daughter for a short walk in the corridor and then back again. And I would look very closely, I mean very politely of course, but I was very conscious of what was going on there, and the mother always looked peaceful and relaxed. Now, that seems a remarkable thing to say, because she must have been under the most incredible burden, if you like, of care in terms of that responsibility over a long, long period of time. But there was nothing in her demeanour that I could see that expressed any sense of weariness or irritability with that situation. And so that's love, isn't it? That's how love works. It's the nature of love to be accommodating like that. And so this idea of accommodation is a very, very profound one. When the French philosopher Derrida came to Australia, he became quite unpopular, Derrida, with the analytical philosophers who believed that he was wacky. But he was asked a question about how to answer the Aboriginal question. And he very wisely said that he wasn't in a position to answer that because he wasn't here. He didn't have enough experience of the Australian sort of social, political scene. But he had put a lot of thought into the idea of accommodation, accommodating the other. And so he's not talking about accommodation as in 3 bedrooms on real.com, realestate.com. He's talking about accommodation, meaning that you allow enough space for the other to dwell safely. A remarkable idea, that if accommodation is actually, Derrida was suggesting, was the ground of our social relation. And so in many cultures, pre-modern cultures, the idea of accommodation is very different. In Tibet, for example, when you're travelling as a nomad in what were incredibly hostile conditions, you came upon a dwelling and you were immediately accommodated. You were accepted in without question. The trust was always already there. You didn't have to ask to be accommodated. You simply had to arrive to be taken in. And so this is a remarkable idea as part of a social contract, that we accommodate each other. If everyone accommodates each other, think about it, we don't need to hang on to mine in the same way, because we'll always have somewhere to stay. It's such a simple idea, but we can't even share our lawnmower or our washing machine, let alone we're trying to share our cars, but it's not clear that's going to work. You know, it's just, we haven't begun to do these things. So the idea of developing some of these more profound, emotional, wise approaches to life begin to alter our perspectives on many things. Yeah. So it's to do with spontaneity as well, so that when you're faced with a situation, if you're calm and relaxed and wise and compassionate, you will know exactly how to respond in that moment. And that's when we're not like that, when we're angry and tense and jealous and whatever, we can't accommodate, can we? Because we're so much with this one that we can't even see who's there or what's there. We don't actually see. We say blind. People say blinded with rage. We actually can be blinded with rage. We can't actually see. This is really interesting. So this idea of radical accommodation, this safety, isn't a protective, narrow safety. It's an open embrace of caring, which would be based on very, very positive states of mind. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that if there was a Buddha alive today, the Buddha would be teaching what he calls secular ethics. So secular ethics is something which is completely outside of any religious structure. We don't need religion. I must say we don't need religion. Some people might want religion and might have religion, but we don't need religion in order to have social ethics. And so we get terribly confused because we think we need this or that. But in actual sexual ethics, which is a form of secular ethics, I'm thinking of sexual ethics here. I mean, a lot of ethics go wrong, don't they? I'm just reading about the court cases at the moment where the student of a private school in Melbourne got $1 million, was it $800,000 or something payout? So they're now saying that the government settlement is actually going to cheat a lot of people of their entitlements because they've been, in the past, they've signed off on do not disclose clauses and they're under incredible distress with no support, and the church has encouraged them to sign these things. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on there. But any form of sort of exploitation still has the same sort of basic features of not respecting the other. And so these meditations are really powerful ways of developing respect for the other. And so in the techniques for developing these minds, the very first one is taught, which is called equanimity, and it says that if we can't love everyone and have compassion for everyone, then at least see if we can have an equal attitude towards everyone. And equal here means, which mentioned in the immeasurable thought, that you're not an absolute stranger, and you're not an absolute friend, and you're not an absolute enemy. Because those three categories are very, very potent, and we cling to them in a way that's totally unreal and exaggerated, and it causes enormous distress. And so we all know this, don't we, from our experience with a family relative who's got a banished relative, someone who's been excommunicated from Christmas or birthday parties, or people are even excommunicated from funerals, let alone births. And so these are really, really interesting examples. And so in Buddhism we have a meditation called the equanimity meditation, which I talked about the first week, where we visualise a friend, an enemy and a stranger in the space in front. And then we explore our responses to those three, and we try to analyse a little bit more deeply what it is that's setting those three categories up. And we discover, perhaps to our shock, that it takes often very little for someone to become our friend. They might have given us a chocolate unexpectedly at an office party, or said hello to us as we turned the corner on the way to the shops. And it's just as curious how trivial or momentary that incident was that led us to call someone an enemy. Because we get offended, for example, and then we go clunk, enemy, and then stay away, enemy. Don't want to know you. And so no matter what that person does, they can't manifest and break through, hey, I'm not an enemy, because, I'm sorry, we've done you, you're enemy. And then the most subtle and the most difficult of the three, interestingly, is the stranger. So what is a stranger here? It's someone who hasn't offended us, and someone who hasn't done something really good to make us feel nice. They're just the general mass who haven't yet got to do either of those two things. And we're constantly shunting people from one to the other like Skittles. So your stranger becomes my best friend, who then becomes my enemy tomorrow, and then I forget my best friend because they become yesterday's best friend. I've got a new best friend over here. I'm developing a new enemy. In fact, they don't like that person, so I might become an enemy as well, because then I can't be their friend. And meanwhile, I haven't got time for the person I was just talking to, because they're now my stranger. And so this process becomes absolutely all-consuming. And so Buddhism says that what's caught up in that process in a more important way is 3 different states of mind. Desirous attachment, connected to my friend, and antagonism or anger, connected to my enemy, and indifference, which is a form of ignorance, connected to the stranger. I'm ignorant of the stranger, but I'm also remaining ignorant of the stranger because I've declared them a stranger. And so who's had the experience of having a stranger in their life who suddenly talked to them and suddenly they're your friend? It's really quite shocking. They've been your friend all along. I had the same thing happen to me with the guy who sold me the newspaper for the last 5 years. He's just the guy who sold me the newspaper, and I discovered he's actually my friend. I'd never bothered to talk to him beyond the moment of that transaction of handing the money over and getting the paper. And so I allowed him, he'd be delighted to hear this, to escape my stranger label box for a sufficient short amount of time for me to begin to see that he wasn't the stereotypical inert, not interesting person who sold me the newspaper who I couldn't bother to talk to for all those years. And so it was me who was setting that up. It was my preconceptions. And so Buddhism says if we work with these 3 categories, we can level the playing field sufficiently. We iron out the bumps so that we then begin to have the opportunity of responding. This gets back to that question, how do we respond out there more realistically? Because we're able to see who's actually there. Simple, who's actually there. And so you look at all the different ways we construct friend, enemy and stranger. You know, it can be on global scales as well, through race and class and so forth. So I think we'll have to finish there. So these are interesting food for thought, isn't it? So ethical practice weaves directly into our actions, basically body, speech and mind. So there's this constant interplay through each other. So we'll just give away any energy in the form of a dedication. So it's been a great pleasure to be able to present and share some ideas and some techniques. So just feel that any benefits that might arise or have arisen can extend outwards so that all beings might achieve whatever they are searching for and desire, right up to full enlightenment. How wonderful. So thank you very much. And there's tea and coffee in the diner, I think, and cake sometimes.